Well, if we take it broadly enough, it's in the business of advancing American interests across a whole range of things. That includes helping American business abroad. It includes negotiating arms control agreements. It includes making sure that our relations with major countries like China and Japan are on a reasonably even keel. And in my own experience, I would say some of the most significant things that we were doing when I was at the State Department under Secretary Shultz was promoting a democratic transition in the Philippines, democratic transition in Korea 1 year later, and I know in many other parts of the world, including in Chile. So it's a very broad mission, but it's all related to American interests. Well, one experience I had as ambassador to Indonesia was trying to get them to revise their copyright laws, because under their copyright laws, unless something had been published initially in Indonesia, it wasn't given copyright protection. It was kind of scandalous, and they were, at the time, pirating our cassette tapes. You may be too young to remember what a cassette tape is, but I think most of your listeners probably would know. And they needed to change the copyright law, and at one point I made a speech publicly criticizing it and saying if it wasn't fixed, we'd have big problems. And the minister who was in charge of dealing with it said to me on a meeting, private meeting, he said, "If you would stop talking so much about what will happen if we don't do it, I can get it done better." And I said, "Okay, you have a deal. I will keep quiet if you get it done." And he got it done. And I think our intellectual property community was very pleased with the result. I think it's hugely important. A great Foreign Service officer, former ambassador to Hungary, who unfortunately passed away much too young, Mark Palmer, when he was in Hungary, was very actively associating the U.S. with the democratic movement in Hungary. This was in 1988-89. He's written a whole handbook for diplomats on how to engage with democratic forces in their countries. I tried to do that rather actively when I was in Indonesia, and when I was back here in the State Department, we went through two huge transitions. One was the transition in the Philippines from Marcos to President Aquino, democratically elected president. And then a year later, the transition from a quite bloody dictator in South Korea to the first democratic election probably in Korea's history. And we now have a continuation for almost 20, more than 20 years, I'm sorry, for almost 30 years of democracy in Korea. And I think American diplomacy in both those cases, and quite a few others that I'm aware of, played a critical role. This is not something that's best done by military force. It's best done through persuasion and by encouraging people to take their future in their own hands. And I think that's where public diplomacy really does contribute. We had some great ambassadors in the Philippines and some great ambassadors in Korea. That helped it to happen. Well, we, in the case of the Philippines, we recognized pretty early on, like almost 3 years before Marcos left power, that the situation was going from bad to worse and that it had to be reversed. But there was a reluctance, I think a proper reluctance, to come out with pronouncements that Marcos had to leave office. We said what Marcos has to do is reform the military, reform the economy, and reform the electoral system, all of which he had been corrupting. And the more he distanced himself from this reform agenda, the more the Philippine people realized he was losing support in Washington. And as that happened, you could almost feel the muscles starting to grow among the Philippine civil society, who I think up until that point had thought the United States will never allow change in our country, which I think was the wrong impression. And by convincing them that the future was in their hands, they really took a hold of it in an impressive way. Incredibly dedicated people. I would say, having worked in different bureaucracies among the, I don't think it's fair to call them bureaucrats, but it's one of the best educated, smartest bureaucracies around. And I think people, underestimate the degree to which they knowingly put themselves into quite dangerous situations. Matter of fact, I had been in Jakarta as ambassador only 1 month. I'm not trying to say this was terrible, but we actually had a homemade rocket that one of the Japanese Red Army people had set up 200 meters outside the embassy, and it landed on the roof of the embassy. Fortunately, he did a very good job with the launcher, but not with the fuse, so the thing never exploded, thank heavens. But as we know Dar es Salaam and Nairobi were not such happy events, and we've, of course, the great tragedy of Ambassador Chris Stevens in Libya, whom I knew a bit, was a wonderful Foreign Service officer, terrific ambassador. I think history might have taken a different course if he had still been around. I would say the first responsibility is to get yourself a good DCM, which I did, and which is the reason I think that we were rated one of the 5 best embassies that the Inspector General had inspected that year. I think you have to be able to delegate, you have to trust your people, you need to give them reasonably good marching orders, and I think you lead by example. I think in my case, for example, to me it was clear that it was time for the embassy to be much more open to what there was of an opposition in Indonesia, and there was a real opposition. These are the people that eventually brought about the democratic transition in Indonesia in 1998, and they're the people who are running for election now, and I think it's a democratic success story. And I think we were able to associate the embassy quite well with civil society, let me put it that way. In fact, civil society is a sort of, maybe it's a inside the bureaucracy term, but it basically means all of those informal organizations. In this country we would call them grassroots organizations. In Indonesia, 2 of the biggest were large Muslim organizations with millions of members, quite moderate, tolerant people with a very different view of Islam than the one that ISIS is peddling around the Middle East these days. Diametrically opposite, actually. And outreach to these people, I think, was important in affecting their attitude toward the United States, because a lot of them maybe tend to be skeptical and think that we're too closely associated with the status quo and the powers that be. And partly, I think, because the more we associate with them, the more they feel empowered to act for themselves. I think if you looked at the case of Burma and Aung San Suu Kyi, you'd see that also. I would say one of the returns has been, you can go around the world, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, South Korea. I go through most of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, or now it's Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, in Latin America, Chile, Argentina with some reservations, Colombia, a whole range of countries that were once ruled by either communist dictators or military dictators that are now democratic, and I do believe the world is more congenial for the United States when democracy is institutionalized in those countries. A heroic role, because talk about dangerous duty, that was dangerous duty. I think complaint you may hear from the military sometimes is there weren't enough of them and they weren't out enough. But it's easy to say that when you've got 150,000 troops. There's no way the Foreign Service can carry the same weight as even a brigade of military when we're talking about pure weight. But I think if you look at the rather remarkable role that was played by General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker working hand in glove, they would go to meetings, they would always go together with the Prime Minister. Petraeus would always share with Crocker everything that he knew, which was often much more because he had people all over the country. So Crocker went there with this deep, deep knowledge of what was happening on the ground, and he was the representative of the US government. Petraeus was junior to him in rank, even though he had a lot more troops. It was a very effective relationship, I think the best I've ever heard of. Not when I was in government. I was out when he was in and vice versa, but he was a force of nature, you might say. And I really admire what he did both for NATO enlargement and in bringing a kind of peace to Bosnia. I say a kind of peace because I still believe that what we ended up with was partition in fact, although not in name. But it was a lot better than the slaughter that was going on before. Well, I know one thing that I said I didn't interact with him. I do remember one occasion when he was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, which is the job that I later had, and I was a fairly lowly Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Pentagon. And right after the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, he held a meeting of Pentagon and State and White House people, and I somehow managed to get invited. And what was evident, actually, as much from John Negroponte, who was in the room, as from Holbrooke himself, but a very deep understanding of this very complicated sort of five-sided competition between China, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and the United States. And I think as Assistant Secretary for East Asia, Holbrooke started an institution that I was a great beneficiary of when I had his job later, which they called it the East Asia Informal. He would use his convening power to get all the agencies, most senior people, CIA, Pentagon, White House, to meet every Monday afternoon privately in his office and talk about what issues were coming up next. And I did the same thing thanks to his having started this. You know, he had a reputation for being maybe a bull in the china shop, but certainly this was not a bull in the china shop approach. This was a let's get them on our team and things will go much better. Oh, it was incredibly difficult there, and a great handicap, I think, because it really was hard to get outside of highly protected areas. I'd say where in there it's almost a no-brainer in a way that you've got to put security first, although people got killed nevertheless. The dilemma is, what if you're in a friendly country? Certainly Indonesia is a very friendly country, but there are 250 million people in the country and a few thousand of them are bad apples. So there is a risk. You don't want to be living behind fortresses so that you're, as I think said already, I think the ability to outreach to the grassroots and not just to officials sitting in their offices is very important. I think the function that USIA in the past used to conduct with lots of small libraries in places like remote Indonesia was hugely valuable, and I think we've been forced to cut back a lot of that because of security. So I think, I don't know how you balance it. I think you have to leave a lot up to the judgment of the people on the scene. I think one thing you can't do is say every time that something went wrong, somebody must have made a mistake on our side, because there has to be a better appreciation of the fact that these are judgment calls. There may be 51-49 judgments, and unless you want to stay buttoned up, in which case you might as well sit in Washington and work on the internet, you're not going to be able to do the job. Well, certainly the visa process is a huge responsibility for the State Department, and it seems to be the way in which you get your chops, and you sort of have to pass that as an initiation. You have to do a tour as a consular officer. And so yes, to the extent that we can manage the visa process and keep bad people out that way, it's certainly something that they have to do, and it's certainly something where they're earning their salaries, although I think they earn their salaries every day in all manner of ways. Well, I think if you look at the challenges the Foreign Service faces, they are very much the challenges that the U.S. faces in foreign policy in general. But then you have to say what is the institutional role of the Foreign Service vis-a-vis those challenges? Obviously, one of those challenges, which we don't talk about enough, I think, is the international economic challenge. And I do think, and George Shultz used to sort of poke fun at them. He's of course a very distinguished economist, and he would say the level of economic literacy in the State Department is not what it should be, which I think was a clear understatement. And I think I would add to that, actually, there's probably a greater need to master some of these obscure languages like Dari and Pashtun, and you're never sure which is going to be the obscure language of 2 years from now. So the Foreign Service does a good job with languages, but I think, if anything, I would say when I was ambassador in Indonesia, I was impressed with the way AID approached it, which was to put their people for a 6 months or a year living with a local family. I think there's no substitute for that way of learning a language on top of whatever you do in class. So, and then I would say one other thing is, how do you deal with the security challenges of today and obviously the issue of terrorism? And I do think one thing that could bring a lot of strength to the Foreign Service is to actively recruit veterans. We have an amazing population of young men and women who've served in the military, many of them in very remote, difficult locations, and I think it brings a skill set that can be very valuable for an embassy, even one that's not in such a remote or difficult situation. So those would be 3 things I would have to suggest. I do think it's very important to think a little less about bridging the divide than bringing other people around to our way of thinking. I know that sounds a little arrogant and imperialistic, but as I think of an example, when I was Assistant Secretary of State, we had a big issue with China about the sale of nuclear reactors, and American law requires certain safeguards be applied to any peaceful nuclear program in order for us to be able to sell. And I remember one rather dramatic moment. We were in Beijing, and George Shultz was confronted by in a big audience of the American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. Some businessmen asked him, why can't we sell nuclear reactors to China the way France and Germany can? And he explained what I just explained, which is this is very sensitive technology and we're ready to sell it, but it has to have the right kind of safeguards around it. And then in a very uncharacteristic Schultz moment, he said, and if you'd rather be a businessman from France or Germany, why don't you move to France or Germany? And he kind of turned on his heel and left. And I think the message to, I'm quite sure he knew that the Chinese intelligence and Chinese foreign ministry were picking up everything that was taking place in that room. And I think the message to them was, don't try to push me around too much because I'm willing to stand up even to the capitalist interests that you think run American foreign policy. So it's good to have a clear view of what our interests are, and as much as possible a view of why the economic principles that we believe in, like free trade and free markets, are ones that will end up helping everybody. That's why knowledge of economics is valuable, to be able to argue with people who say, no, we have to protect this or that industry because all sorts of people will lose jobs if we don't. And of course the answer is a lot of people are losing jobs because you do, and you need to carry that argument. And then of course at the end of the day, I be a little less arrogant, you do have to compromise. You do have to recognize that there's only so far any country, including the United States, can move, especially when we're talking about issues that deeply affect people's jobs and their futures, and whether they're going to be able to pay for their kids to go to college and all of those kinds of issues. Well, I guess I have to admit to begin with that I sort of fell in love with Indonesia, not because the weather's great or the traffic in Jakarta isn't miserable, it is, but because I felt this is a wonderful example of a tolerant society which is overwhelmingly Muslim. And I thought that's a rather important thing for the world. So I set about trying to become as prominent a national figure as I could be. And one of the fun things about being in a country like Indonesia that isn't, at least back then, wasn't flooded with visitors from Washington every week the way Paris or London would be, is you really are the image and the voice of the United States. And I thought about the fact that when I leave, it's going to make a difference what I say. And of course, I can say it's a beautiful country, that I like the people, that the economic progress has been impressive. But if I stop there, people will say, oh yes, that's code word. The Americans love our dictator. Or be more polite, the authoritarian ruler, but President Suharto. And I thought it was very important to put down a marker, and I said, if Indonesia is going to progress as much in the next 25 years as it has in the last 25, there has to be greater political openness as well. I said political openness instead of democracy. I didn't want to sound like I was imposing some American idea on them. And what was really gratifying was this it was like a spark on kindling, and The Indonesians were so ready for that message. They believed it themselves. Everybody except Suharto himself, who continued to complain about it once to Time magazine 2 years later, once to his ministers at a Ramadan breakfast dinner 10 years later. I thought, well, if my goal was to send a message that the U.S. isn't completely in bed with Suharto and we're not completely happy with what's going on here, then mission accomplished.